Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The fluorescent hum of the faculty lounge was a familiar, comforting drone, a counterpoint to the vibrant chaos of the students Emily left behind in room 207. 20 years old, barely out of her own student days, she thrived on that energy, on the way a well-placed question could ignite a spark in a young mind. Her literature classes weren't just about parsing prose, they were about uncovering the hidden narratives in every person, every situation. She saw stories everywhere, in the nervous fidgeting of a shy freshman, the knowing glance between two best friends, the worn spines of the books lining the shelves. Each was a tiny universe waiting to be explored, a chapter yearning to be written, and Emily, with her bright eyes and quick smile, felt like she held the key. Her own story, she often mused, was just beginning. Her small apartment, though cluttered with books and half-finished manuscripts, felt like a launching pad. She dreamed of publishing a collection of interconnected short stories, each one a testament to the quiet dramas of everyday life, a mosaic of human experience. The working title, scrawled on a yellow legal pad next to her perpetually half-empty coffee mug, was Echoes and Threads. She spent hours observing, absorbing, mentally crafting backstories for the bus driver, the barista, the elderly woman who always bought 2 scoops of pistachio ice cream. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an innate way of being, a constant process of narrative construction. Her Aunt Beatrice, a wonderfully eccentric former theater director with a flair for the dramatic and an uncanny ability to read between the lines, was her biggest champion and occasional sounding board. "Darling Emily," Beatrice would intone, sweeping into Emily's apartment like a gust of theatrical wind. "Your mind is a veritable playhouse. Each person, a character. Each day, a scene. Just remember to write your own magnificent leading role." Emily would laugh, a clear, bell-like sound, and promised to do just that. Today, however, the familiar hum of the lounge felt a little off-key, a subtle dissonance. She'd been teaching a particularly engaging lesson on stream of consciousness in Woolf, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the word reverberation had vanished from her mind, leaving a gaping, silent chasm in her carefully constructed lecture. She'd felt a prickle of panic, quickly masked by a practiced pivot to a student's insightful comment. Later, walking home, an odd exhaustion had settled over her, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. She dismissed it as the tail end of a persistent cold, or perhaps just the usual end-of-semester burnout. Her life was full, yes, overflowing even, but it was a vibrant, joyful kind of overwhelm. This was different. Aunt Beatrice, however, possessed a finely tuned antenna for Emily's well-being. She noticed the small things, the way Emily had snapped at a telemarketer, uncharacteristically, or the unkempt state of her usually meticulous hair. "Emily, my dear," Beatrice had said, her voice softer than usual, a subtle shift from her customary booming pronouncements. "You seem out of tune, a little like a stage light flickering erratically before the grand performance." Emily had waved a dismissive hand. "Just tired, Aunt B. Too many papers to grade, too many student dramas to navigate." But Beatrice was persistent. "No, this is more than fatigue. You're losing words, Emily. And that, for you, is like a painter losing her colors. It's not right. You need to see a doctor, a proper one, not just the campus clinic." Her gaze was unwavering, filled with a quiet concern that Emily couldn't easily brush off. The insistence, gentle but firm, chipped away at Emily's own dismissal. A seed of unease, tiny but persistent, began to sprout. The first doctor, a harried GP, attributed her symptoms to stress and prescribed rest. But Beatrice, with her unwavering conviction that something was profoundly amiss, pushed for more. She badgered specialists, navigated labyrinthine referral systems, and finally, after what felt like an eternity of tests, blood work, then a neurological consult, then an MRI, and finally the terrifying, invasive bone marrow biopsy, the diagnosis landed with the force of an unwritten, tragic chapter: atypical lymphoma, a rare, aggressive form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma with unusual neurological manifestations. The oncologist, a kind-faced man with tired eyes, spoke in measured tones, explaining the rapid onset, the severe fatigue, the cognitive disinhibition that Emily had dismissed as impulsiveness, and the intermittent aphasia that had stolen her words. It was like listening to a medical script, except the protagonist was her. The words swirled around her, clinical and detached, yet impossibly personal, atypical, aggressive, neurological involvement. Emily felt a cold terror grip her heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her carefully constructed narrative of a vibrant, promising future shattered into a million sharp fragments. This wasn't a minor plot twist. This was a complete, devastating rewrite. Her body, her own internal story, had betrayed her. Aunt Beatrice, usually so composed, so theatrical in her grief, was utterly silent, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly. When the doctor finished, she simply whispered, "No, this cannot be. Not our Emily." Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual bravado, a fragile thread in the face of such an enormous, terrifying truth. The world, which had always felt like a boundless narrative, had suddenly become a very small, very bleak, unwritten chapter. Connected short stories, each a tiny universe, a tapestry woven from the lives she observed. Aunt Beatrice, her eccentric, flamboyant aunt, a retired theater director with a flair for the dramatic, often chided her for observing too much and living too little. But Emily knew observation was living, a quiet communion with the vast human experience. Then the static began. It was subtle at first, a faint interference in the otherwise clear signal of her life. The first incident came during a lecture on symbolism in Hemingway. Mid-sentence, describing the symbolic weight of the old man's struggle with the marlin, the word resolve simply vanished. Gone. Her mouth formed the shape, her mind knew the concept, but the sound wouldn't materialize. She stammered, fumbled, her usual articulate flow stuttering to a halt. A mild panic fluttered in her chest, quickly dismissed as a momentary slip, a natural consequence of her demanding schedule. She blamed the late nights grading papers, the early mornings planning lessons, the intense energy she poured into her students. The fatigue was harder to ignore. It wasn't the satisfying exhaustion after a long day. It was a bone-deep weariness that sleep refused to touch. She'd wake up feeling as though she hadn't slept at all, her limbs heavy, her eyelids gritty. Coffee, once a pleasant ritual, became a desperate necessity, offering only a brief, illusory surge before the crushing weight returned. Even her beloved books, usually a source of endless fascination, felt like lead in her hands. Then there was the impulsiveness, the disturbing loss of her usual measured control. During a faculty meeting, she blurted out a scathing critique of a new curriculum initiative, a raw, unfiltered assessment that surprised even herself. The words were true, yes, but utterly out of character for her usually diplomatic nature. Later, she found herself buying an expensive, brightly colored sculpture she neither liked nor could afford, a spontaneous, unthinking act that left her with a vague sense of unease. It was as if a tiny, mischievous imp had taken up residence in her brain, occasionally hijacking her thoughts and actions. Aunt Beatrice, with her director's eye for nuance and her lifetime of reading human performance, noticed. She saw the subtle tremor in Emily's hand as she poured tea, the slight hesitation before Emily spoke, the uncharacteristic blankness in her usually sparkling eyes. "Darling," she'd said one Tuesday afternoon, her voice softer than usual, "you look like you're starring in a tragic play you didn't audition for. You're fading, Emily. You need to see a doctor. This isn't just stress, not for you." Emily, annoyed by what she perceived as an unnecessary fuss, brushed her off. "Beatrice, I'm fine, just overworked. You know how it is, the end of the semester crunch." She attempted a bright, dismissive smile, but even that felt like an effort, a mask she was struggling to hold in place. "Besides, I have a story to finish. The last chapter is forming in my head." But Aunt Beatrice, for all her theatricality, possessed a stubborn streak. She'd been a rock for Emily after her parents passed, a grounding force in Emily's often ethereal world of words and ideas. She saw through the forced cheerfulness, the almost desperate denial. She continued to press, gently at first, then with a quiet, unwavering persistence that Emily found impossible to resist. "Emily, please, just a checkup. For me, humor your ancient, dramatic aunt." Reluctantly, Emily agreed. The first few doctor visits were dismissive, echoing her own initial thoughts. Stress, burnout, perhaps a vitamin deficiency. But Aunt Beatrice insisted on more, pushing for specialists, for deeper investigations. "My intuition is rarely wrong, darling," she declared, her chin set with a director's resolve. "And my intuition says this script needs a rewrite." Emily, exhausted by the constant prodding and the relentless fatigue, eventually conceded. The battery of tests began, a dizzying blur of appointments, bright lights, and sterile rooms. Blood draws, endless questionnaires. Then the MRI, a loud claustrophobic tunnel that made her already frayed nerves hum with anxiety. Then came the lumbar puncture, a sharp, invasive sting that left her with a throbbing headache. And finally, the bone marrow biopsy, a truly excruciating procedure that made her cry out despite herself. Each test stripped away another layer of her denial, replacing it with a cold, creeping dread. The doctors' faces grew more serious with each passing day, their hushed conversations outside the examination room growing longer, their gazes at her increasingly pitying. The day the results came in, the air in the consultation room felt thick and suffocating. Dr. Aris, a kind-faced neurologist, sat opposite them, his hands clasped on the table. Beside him, Dr. Chen, an oncologist with tired eyes, held a thick file. Emily sat rigidly, Aunt Beatrice gripping her hand, her nails digging in. "Emily," Dr. Aris began, his voice gentle but firm, "the results of all your tests have come back. It's not what we hoped." He paused, taking a breath. "You have a rare and aggressive form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Atypical lymphoma." The words hung in the air, a death knell. Lymphoma. Cancer. The word felt alien, a foreign, invading entity in her vibrant, word-filled world. Aunt Beatrice gasped, a small, choked sound. Dr. Chen took over, explaining the specifics in a calm, clinical voice that somehow made the horror more real. "It's atypical because of its unusual neurological involvement. The fatigue, the aphasia, your difficulty with language, and the cognitive disinhibition, the impulsiveness you've been experiencing, are all manifestations of the lymphoma affecting your central nervous system. It's infiltrating the brain and spinal cord." He spoke of rapid onset, of chemotherapy, of prognosis, a terrifying cascade of medical jargon that Emily could barely process. Her mind, usually so quick to grasp and interpret, felt like a broken language decoder. Emily felt a cold, crushing weight descend upon her. Her world, once a vibrant tapestry of narratives, instantly unraveled into a tangle of fear and disbelief. A story, yes, but not the one she had envisioned. This was a tragedy, a cruel, unscripted twist in her own unfolding narrative. Aunt Beatrice, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock, squeezed Emily's hand tighter, her earlier theatricality replaced by a raw, unadulterated terror. The promise of future narratives, of the books she would write, the lives she would shape, evaporated, replaced by a single terrifying question. What story would be left to tell? The curtain had fallen, not on a triumphant close, but on an abrupt, terrifying interlude. The smooth, narrative-driven flow of her life had been violently disrupted, leaving behind only incoherent gaps and erratic, frightening behaviors. Her life, once a well-crafted manuscript, now felt like a vandalized, unfinished sentence. She blamed the late nights grading papers, the early mornings planning lessons, the constant hum of her own creative pursuits. But the static persisted, grew louder, more insistent. The profound fatigue wasn't just a byproduct of her demanding schedule. It became a lead blanket draped over her, pressing her down into the mattress each morning, making the simple act of lifting her head an Everestian task. Sleep, once her body's faithful restorative, offered no solace. She'd wake feeling as if she'd run a marathon in her dreams, her limbs heavy, her mind a murky fog. Then there was the disturbing impulsiveness, small at first, like blurting out an unfiltered opinion during a faculty meeting, an uncharacteristic sharp edge to her usually empathetic responses. Later, it morphed into more unsettling acts. An inexplicable urge to rearrange the books in the library by color instead of subject. An overwhelming desire to walk out of a crowded grocery store without paying for a single item. An urge she fought with every fiber of her being, leaving her breathless and shaking by the checkout. She dismissed them all, each fleeting symptom, as stress, as overwork, as an eccentric quirk of her artistic temperament. It was Aunt Beatrice, with her theatrical sensibilities and uncanny ability to read between the lines of human behavior, who saw past Emily's dismissals. "Emily, darling," she'd said one Tuesday evening, her voice a low purr as she watched Emily attempt to butter toast, only to smear it inexplicably across the counter. "You're off key, like a violin string stretched too tight, about to snap." Emily had laughed, a brittle sound that lacked her usual warmth. "Just tired, Aunt B. The spring semester always drains me." But Aunt Beatrice wasn't deterred. She observed Emily's vacant stares into space, her sudden shifts in conversation, the way her usually nimble fingers fumbled with a teacup. She noticed the subtle hesitation before Emily could recall a student's name, a name she'd repeated 100 times. "No, my dear," Aunt Beatrice had insisted, her voice firm but laced with concern. "This is more than just fatigue. This is an unwritten chapter, and it feels like a dark one. You're going to see Dr. Evans tomorrow." Emily, annoyed by the interruption to her carefully curated routine, by the implicit suggestion that her body was betraying her, had initially resisted. "Aunt B, I'm fine. Just a little rundown. I'll rest over the weekend." But Aunt Beatrice, with the unwavering persistence of a seasoned director, ensuring her star performer didn't miss their cue, had already booked the appointment. "No arguments, Emily. This isn't a suggestion, it's a directive." And so Emily found herself in the sterile, hushed environment of Dr. Evans' office. The initial consultation led to a cascade of referrals: neurologists, hematologists, oncologists. Blood tests became more specialized, followed by an MRI, then a lumbar puncture, and finally the bone marrow biopsy. Each procedure felt like another layer of her carefully constructed life being peeled away, exposing something raw and vulnerable beneath. The waiting rooms blurred into one long, anxious vigil, punctuated by the cold touch of medical instruments, the polite yet distant smiles of nurses, and the increasing weight of Aunt Beatrice's silent, worried presence beside her. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Aunt Beatrice had first noticed the smear of butter on the counter. Dr. Evans, a woman with kind eyes but a weary countenance, sat across from them, her voice calm, professional, yet imbued with an unmistakable gravity. "Emily, Aunt Beatrice, the results are conclusive. You have a typical lymphoma." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreign, like an alien language. Emily felt a sudden, profound chill despite the warmth of the room. Lymphoma, cancer. The word resonated with an ominous, final sound. "Atypical. What does that mean, doctor?" Aunt Beatrice's voice was a frail whisper, utterly devoid of its usual theatricality. Dr. Evans adjusted her glasses. "It means it's a rare and aggressive form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma with unusual neurological manifestations. The aphasia, the cognitive disinhibition, the profound fatigue. These are all consistent with the way this particular lymphoma affects the central nervous system. It's been very aggressive in your case, given the rapid onset of symptoms." Rapid onset, aggressive, neurological. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the delicate porcelain of Emily's perceived health. She stared at her hands, surprised to see them still, not trembling. Her mind, however, was reeling. This wasn't just stress. This wasn't a rundown feeling. This was a hostile invasion, a parasitic narrative hijacking her own. Atypical lymphoma. The name itself felt like a curse, a cruel twist of fate for someone so devoted to the precise power of language. Aunt Beatrice, ever the pragmatist, immediately shifted. Her face, pale moments before, now bore a fierce determination. "What's the prognosis? What's the treatment plan? We fight this, right?" Her voice cracked on the last word, but her gaze was resolute, fixed on Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of countless difficult conversations. The prognosis for a typical lymphoma is challenging, especially with neurological involvement. It responds to aggressive chemotherapy, but the journey will be arduous. We'll start with a multi-agent chemotherapy regimen immediately. It will be intensive, and the side effects will be significant, particularly given the neurological impact already present. Emily felt a profound sadness, a sense of betrayal by her own body. Her vibrant, story-filled life, the one she had so carefully crafted and nurtured, now felt like a fragile manuscript dropped into a raging fire. All her dreams of interconnected short stories, her future narratives, seemed to dissolve into ash. In that moment, the universe, once a boundless source of inspiration, felt like a cruel, indifferent editor, slashing through her chapters, leaving only blank pages and the terrifying prospect of an unfinished story. The vague fears had solidified into a terrifying, concrete medical reality, marking an abrupt, brutal end to the narrative she had always envisioned for herself. The fight she knew was just beginning, but a part of her wondered if she was already too far gone, swallowed by the ominous silence that had descended upon her life. The sterile smell of the oncology ward became Emily's new reality, a harsh contrast to the comforting scent of old books and classroom chalk. Her hair, once a vibrant cascade of auburn, began to thin, falling out in pale, lifeless strands that clung to her pillow and collected in the drain. Chemotherapy, a word that had once felt abstract and distant, was now a visceral, punishing intruder. Each session was a descent into a new circle of hell. The nausea was relentless, a churning abyss in her stomach that left her weak and trembling. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue that dwarfed any exhaustion she had ever known from late-night grading sessions. This was a fatigue that seeped into her very bones, leaving her an empty vessel, devoid of energy, hope, or even the will to move. But the physical torment was almost secondary to the neurological onslaught. The aphasia, once an intermittent annoyance, now asserted its dominance, a cruel warden locking away her words. Sentences would fray in her mind, concepts would dissolve before they could be articulated. She'd stare at Aunt Beatrice, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, desperate to communicate the searing pain or the bewildering fog that enveloped her thoughts. But the words simply wouldn't come. Her mind, once a bustling library of narratives, was now a chaotic jumble of misfiled thoughts and blank pages. The cognitive disinhibition, too, intensified. Filters that had once governed her interactions crumbled. She would blurt out inappropriate comments to nurses, accuse Aunt Beatrice of imagined slights, or burst into inexplicable fits of tears or laughter. It was as if a stranger had taken up residence in her brain, pulling levers at random, making her a puppet of her own malfunctioning neurology. "Emily, darling, you need to eat something," Aunt Beatrice would coax, holding a spoonful of bland broth. Emily would stare at it, the liquid appearing alien, unappetizing. Sometimes, in a fit of sudden, inexplicable rage, she would knock the spoon away, sending the broth spilling across the white sheets. Aunt Beatrice, always patient, always understanding, would simply sigh and clean it up. Emily hated it. She hated the pity in Aunt Beatrice's eyes, the forced cheerfulness of the nurses, the hushed whispers outside her room. Most of all, she hated the way everyone treated her like a story. Every worried glance, every gentle inquiry felt like an attempt to write her narrative, to define her by her illness. And she refused. She absolutely refused to be the patient with lymphoma. That wasn't her story. Her story was vivid, full of words and students and distant lands she longed to explore. This was a detour, a terrible misprinted chapter that she wanted to tear out and burn. "They just want to help, sweet pea," Aunt Beatrice murmured one afternoon, stroking Emily's clammy forehead. "Dr. Elam, he's coming by later to explain the next step." Emily's eyes, dull and sunken, darted to Aunt Beatrice. "No," she croaked, the word thick and slurred. "No talk. No words." Aunt Beatrice paused, her hand hovering. "No words about what, darling?" "This," Emily rasped, waving a trembling hand vaguely around the sterile room. "This story, not mine." Each word was a struggle, each one a tiny act of defiance. Aunt Beatrice's face softened with a familiar sadness. But it is, my love. It's a chapter you're living through, and we're living it with you. No! The force of the word surprised even Emily, sending a jolt of pain through her head. No, if I say it, it's real. It's my story. She squeezed her eyes shut, a tear tracing a path down her temple. Don't make it real. She began to reject visitors. Her former colleagues from the school sent cards and flowers, which Aunt Beatrice dutifully read to her, but Emily would turn her head away. Her students, who adored her, sent a large, colorful banner plastered with their signatures and well wishes. Aunt Beatrice hung it on the barren wall opposite Emily's bed, hoping it would bring some cheer. Emily looked at it, her eyes devoid of recognition. Clutter, she mumbled, then turned her face to the wall. Emily, it's from your students. Aunt Beatrice tried again, her voice laced with desperation. They miss you. They're thinking of you. No, more stories, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. No, more words. She had always believed that to name something was to give it power. If she named her illness, if she spoke of it, she would be giving it more power over her, making it the dominant narrative of her life. She was a wordsmith, a weaver of tales, and she understood the potent magic of language. By refusing to acknowledge the story of her sickness, perhaps she could deny its existence, shrink its power, make it disappear back into the unwritten void from which it had sprung. Aunt Beatrice, ever the director, recognized the resistance, the refusal to engage with the script. She tried different tactics. She brought in Emily's favorite books, reading aloud passages from Virginia Woolf and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, hoping the familiar cadences would break through the fog. But Emily would simply stare blankly, her eyes unfocused, or worse, become agitated, demanding she stop. Noise, she'd grumble. Too many words. The very things that had once defined Emily, her love for literature and narrative, now seemed to be a source of torment. One afternoon, a young resident, Dr. Chen, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, sat by Emily's bedside. Emily, she said softly, we understand this is incredibly difficult, but we need you to cooperate with us. We need to know how you're feeling, what your symptoms are. It helps us adjust your treatment. Emily just stared at her, her jaw clenched. Her mind was a whirlpool of agony, a tempest of jumbled thoughts. How could she explain the electric current that sometimes shot through her brain, or the way familiar faces would suddenly morph into grotesque caricatures? How could she articulate the constant feeling of being trapped behind a wall of glass, observing her own body's betrayal? The words for these sensations simply did not exist in her fractured lexicon. Can you tell me, Emily, are you in pain? Dr. Chen pressed gently. Emily blinked slowly, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. She could feel the pain, a dull throb behind her eyes, a sharp ache in her joints. But the word pain felt inadequate, a pathetic descriptor for the totality of her suffering. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them understand that it wasn't just pain, it was a complete unraveling. But all that came out was a strangled sound, half cough, half sob. Dr. Chen sighed, a quiet, defeated sound, and made a note on her chart. We'll try to manage the discomfort with medication, Emily. Just try to rest. As the days bled into weeks, Emily retreated further into herself. She was no longer Emily, the vibrant literature teacher, the aspiring author. She was a body, a vessel for the aggressive chemicals coursing through her veins, a mind besieged by its own failing architecture. The only stories she experienced were the grotesque, hallucinatory narratives her brain conjured in the depths of fever and chemical haze. She began to believe that if she just remained silent, if she refused to engage, if she became a blank page, then perhaps the story of her illness would have no plot, no characters, and eventually no ending. It would simply cease to exist. The world of words, her lifelong companion, had become a terrifying enemy, threatening to solidify her nightmare into an inescapable reality. Aunt Beatrice, watching her niece fade, her spirited Emily reduced to a hollow shell, felt a cold dread creep into her heart. She was losing her, not just to the cancer, but to the silence, to the terrifying self-imposed exile from her own narrative. The vibrant tapestry of Emily's life was unraveling thread by thread, and Aunt Beatrice, for the first time, felt truly helpless. She had always believed in the power of stories, in the healing balm of shared narratives. But Emily, the very person who had taught her that, was now staunchly refusing to participate in her own. The only thing worse than hearing her niece in pain was the terrifying void of her silence. The sterile smell of the oncology ward became Emily's new reality, a harsh contrast to the comforting scent of old books and classroom chalk. Her hair, once a vibrant cascade of auburn, began to thin, falling out in pale, lifeless strands that clung to her pillow and collected in the drain. Chemotherapy, a word that had once felt abstract and distant, was now a visceral, punishing intruder. Each session was a descent into a new circle of hell. The nausea was relentless, a churning abyss in her stomach that left her weak and trembling. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue that dwarfed any exhaustion she had ever known from late-night grading sessions. This was a fatigue that seeped into her very bones, leaving her an empty vessel, devoid of energy, hope, or even the will to move. But the physical torment was almost secondary to the neurological onslaught. The aphasia, once an intermittent annoyance, now asserted its dominance, a cruel warden locking away her words. Sentences splintered in her mind, thoughts fractured before they could be formed. She would stare at Aunt Beatrice, her mouth opening and closing, a desperate fish gasping for air, only to produce a jumble of syllables that made no sense. Water? No. Glass? Floor? Glick? It was like trying to scoop mist with a sieve. The cognitive disinhibition, too, intensified. One afternoon, during a visit from her kind but perpetually worried colleague, Mr. Henderson, Emily inexplicably ripped a page from the medical journal he was reading, then giggled, a hollow, uncharacteristic sound that froze Mr. Henderson in his tracks. Aunt Beatrice quickly ushered him out, her face a mask of practiced calm, but her eyes held a deeper pain. Emily began to reject almost everyone. Calls went unanswered, texts unread. Visitors, no matter how well-meaning, felt like intruders, their concerned faces reflecting a pity she couldn't bear. Their questions, always about her health, about how she was feeling, felt like barbed hooks, dragging her deeper into the narrative of her illness. "How are you?" was a question that felt like an accusation, a demand to articulate the unspeakable. She knew intellectually that they cared, that they wanted to help, but every word spoken about her condition, every sympathetic glance, every hushed whisper about her prognosis, felt like another brick in the wall of her sick identity. She was Emily, the literature teacher, the aspiring writer, the vibrant spirit. She was not Emily, the cancer patient. To engage with it, to talk about it, to even acknowledge it aloud, felt like signing a contract, surrendering her true self to the suffocating script of sickness. She was desperate to deny this narrative, to keep it from becoming her definitive story. So she retreated, pulling inward, letting silence be her shield. Aunt Beatrice, the only one she still tolerated, would sit by her bedside, often in quiet communion, sometimes reading aloud from Emily's favorite poetry, her voice a balm in the suffocating quiet. But even then, Emily often kept her eyes closed, feigning sleep, afraid that even a shared glance might pull her into a conversation she couldn't bear to have. She was fading, not just physically, but as the Emily she knew herself to be. Emily's world shrank to the four walls of her hospital room, then further to the confines of her own failing body. The chemotherapy, instead of offering a lifeline, felt like it was accelerating her decline. Her once keen mind, the very engine of her being, was now a wasteland of fractured thoughts and forgotten words. She became largely nonverbal, her aphasia so profound that even pointing to an object was a monumental effort, often resulting in a frustrated whimper or a vacant stare. Her cognitive function was severely impaired. She would often gaze at the ceiling, her eyes glazed, utterly unresponsive to the world around her. The doctors, their faces etched with concern, spoke in hushed tones about neurological decline and palliative care. Aunt Beatrice, a woman who had always met challenges with a steely resolve, now moved with a desperate, frantic energy. She consulted every specialist, every alternative healer, every spiritual guide she could find. A kind-faced woman with flowing robes and a gentle voice attempted crystal healing, placing cool, smooth stones on Emily's chest. A man with intense eyes chanted ancient Sanskrit mantras, his voice vibrating through the sterile air. An acupuncturist carefully inserted fine needles into Emily's limp limbs. Aunt Beatrice, usually so grounded in practicality, clung to every wisp of hope, but Emily remained unresponsive. Her eyes, once so bright and expressive, were vacant pools reflecting nothing. The essence of Emily, the vibrant literary soul, seemed to have receded, leaving behind only an empty shell. It wasn't just a loss of physical ability, it was a profound crisis of faith, not in a deity, but in the very idea of meaning, of narrative itself. Her life, once a meticulously crafted story, complete with rising action, character development, and the promise of a glorious climax, had devolved into a meaningless jumble of symptoms and suffering. The words, her words that had once flowed so freely, were now trapped behind an impenetrable wall. Her mind, the sanctuary of her narratives, felt like a blank page, utterly devoid of ink, of purpose, of hope. There was no story here, no meaning, just a slow, painful erasure. Aunt Beatrice, watching her niece slip away, felt a raw, tearing despair. Exhausted and terrified, her own energy reserves were dangerously depleted. She would spend hours just holding Emily's hand, murmuring meaningless reassurances, her voice hoarse from unshed tears. The hospital room, once filled with the faint hum of medical equipment, now seemed to thrum with the silent agony of two souls trapped in a nightmare. Emily's internal world had become an echoing void, a place where even the faintest whisper of hope could not penetrate. She was adrift, completely lost in the vast, terrifying emptiness of her own mind. Sentence fragments hung in the air, unfinished thoughts dissolving into static before they could solidify. The cognitive disinhibition, far from amusing, was terrifying. She might blurt out an inappropriate comment to a nurse, or laugh at a somber prognosis, her mind a runaway train with no brakes. It was as if the very language she cherished, the stories she lived for, had turned against her, becoming a weapon of confusion and isolation. She began to reject visitors, their well-meaning words feeling like cacophonous noise in her scrambled brain. Even Aunt Beatrice, with her gentle persistence, faced Emily's increasingly rigid resistance. "No," Emily would rasp, turning her face to the wall, or simply shaking her head, a desperate refusal to engage. Why give voice to this monstrous thing consuming her? Why acknowledge its reality, its creeping tendrils around her identity? To speak of it, to articulate the horror, would be to make it undeniably real, to etch it forever into the narrative of her life. She had always controlled her stories, shaped them, polished them. This one she couldn't. This one was writing her, erasing her, sentence by agonizing sentence. The idea of her bright, hopeful literary future, once a vibrant tapestry, was now a tattered, unraveling thread. Her body, a canvas of vibrant life, had become a prison. Her mind, once a bustling library of words and ideas, was now a silent, echoing void. The doctors, their faces etched with concern, spoke in hushed tones of neurological decline and profound cognitive impairment. Emily, though she heard the words, felt them detached, as if they were discussing someone else. She had retreated so far within herself that the external world was a blur, a meaningless hum. Aunt Beatrice, a woman who usually navigated life with the theatrical flourish of a director, was now a ghost of her former self. Her practical, problem-solving nature, usually her greatest strength, was failing her. She brought in specialists from every corner of the alternative healing world. A Reiki master whose hands hovered over Emily's inert form, radiating what felt to Emily like nothing but cool air. An acupuncturist who left tiny needles glinting in her skin, like forgotten sequins on a discarded costume. A quiet woman who spoke of crystal energies and chakra alignment. her voice a soothing drone that Emily barely registered. None of it touched her. Her eyes, once sparkling with intelligence and mischief, were dull, vacant, staring at nothing. Her mouth was often slightly agape, a silent O of apathy. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was a garbled syllable, a broken sound that held no meaning. Eating was a chore, swallowing a monumental effort. She was fading, a story erased not by an editor's pen, but by an encroaching blankness. The spiritual theme that had always underscored Emily's life, the belief in the power of narrative, of shared human experience, of finding meaning in connection, had crumbled. What was the meaning in this? What story could be salvaged from this wreckage? Her mind felt like a blank page, not one waiting to be filled, but one utterly, terrifyingly empty. She had lost faith not in a divine being, but in the very fabric of existence that allowed for meaning, for stories, for connection. She was a single unwritten chapter, and she felt nothing but the vast, cold expanse of an unwritten universe. Aunt Beatrice, witnessing this agonizing decline, felt a terror she had never known. Her niece, her vibrant, word-loving Emily, was disappearing before her eyes, swallowed by an unspeakable silence. The hospital room, once filled with the muted beeps of medical equipment, was now suffused with the unbearable quiet of despair. Aunt Beatrice, exhausted and desperate, could only hold Emily's skeletal hand, tears streaming down her face, a silent scream of helplessness. One afternoon, Aunt Beatrice sat by Emily's bed, rifling through a box of Emily's old school papers she'd brought from the apartment. She pulled out a stack of creative writing assignments from Emily's students, each one a testament to Emily's impact. Emily had always said her greatest joy was seeing her students find their voice, craft their own narratives. Aunt Beatrice remembered Emily's excited phone calls, her descriptions of particularly insightful short stories, her pride in their nascent literary talents. A desperate idea sparked. She found her phone and, with trembling fingers, began to record herself reading the stories aloud. She started with a particularly poignant one, written by a shy freshman about his grandmother's quiet resilience during a difficult harvest. The boy had initially struggled with the assignment, feeling his grandmother's life was boring. Emily had gently guided him, helped him see the epic in the everyday. As Aunt Beatrice read the simple, heartfelt words, her voice wavering, she glanced at Emily. And then she saw it, a flicker. Not a movement, not a sound, but a subtle shift in Emily's vacant eyes, a minuscule tremor in her eyelid. It was so fleeting, so imperceptible, Aunt Beatrice almost dismissed it as wishful thinking, a trick of the light. But she read on, her voice imbued with a renewed, fragile hope. When she finished the story, she paused, her breath held. Emily's gaze, though still distant, seemed to orient slightly toward the sound. Aunt Beatrice remembered Emily's own love for creating narratives, for weaving meaning from the threads of human experience. "Emily, my love," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "I met the most remarkable nurse today. Her name is Clara. She has these eyes like deep pools of wisdom, and she moves with such quiet dignity. You know, the kind of person who carries 1,000 unspoken stories within her. She's like an unwritten chapter, waiting for someone to notice the quiet heroism in her daily rounds." She continued, her voice a soft murmur in the sterile room, narrating the lives of the people she encountered at the hospital, the stoic security guard who always offered a kind nod, the worried father in the waiting room whose hands trembled as he clutched a worn teddy bear, the cafeteria worker whose gentle smile was a small beacon of warmth. She didn't embellish, she simply observed, and then she spoke, framing their lives as unwritten chapters, just as Emily would have done. Emily's eyes, though still largely vacant, now seemed to follow the rise and fall of Aunt Beatrice's voice, a faint stirring of recognition replacing the utter blankness. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but for Aunt Beatrice, it was everything. A sliver of light in the profound darkness, a fragile hope, a whisper against the roaring silence of despair. The external world, the narratives that Emily once cherished and fostered, had finally found a way to penetrate her internal blankness. The seeds of connection, sown through the simple act of storytelling, were starting to sprout, however faintly. Giant narrative of her life. She would not give it that power. The room, a sterile box with a single window overlooking a perpetually gray sky, had become her fortress and her prison. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the grim rituals of medication, blood draws, and the intermittent, agonizing sessions of chemotherapy. Emily's rejection of the outside world, of any acknowledgement of her illness, had solidified into an almost pathological avoidance. Aunt Beatrice, ever present, a silent sentinel by her bedside, tried everything. She read aloud from Emily's favorite novels, the rich prose of Dickens and Austen, hoping to stir something within her. She brought in Emily's students' essays, their earnest, sometimes clumsy, but always heartfelt attempts at storytelling, thinking the familiar voices might pierce the veil of apathy. But Emily remained a blank canvas, her eyes either closed in a restless, drug-induced sleep, or open and vacant, staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing. Then came the day the music changed. Not actual music, but a shift in the air, a subtle vibration that Aunt Beatrice, with her theater director's uncanny intuition for emotional nuance, picked up on. She had been playing a recording, not of Emily's students' essays, but of their creative writing assignments. Emily had always emphasized the importance of vulnerability in storytelling, encouraging them to find the extraordinary in the ordinary, the universal in the personal. This particular recording was from a shy, quiet boy named Leo, whose grandmother had recently passed away. His story, haltingly read, was about the quiet resilience of an old woman who spent her days meticulously mending torn garments, each stitch a testament to love and endurance. Leo described the thread not as a simple fiber, but as a lifeline, weaving together memories and keeping a family whole. As Leo's voice, fragile yet resonant, filled the room, a flicker, no more than a phantom tremor, passed across Emily's face. It was so fleeting, Aunt Beatrice almost missed it, attributing it to a muscle twitch, a drug-induced spasm. But then, as Leo described the grandmother's gnarled hands, calloused from years of work, gently smoothing a patch, Emily's own hand, lying inert on the white sheet, twitched almost imperceptibly. Aunt Beatrice held her breath. Was it possible? She tried another. A boisterous girl named Chloe, whose story was a whimsical ode to her neighbor, an elderly man who meticulously cultivated a miniature forest of bonsai trees in his tiny backyard, each one a universe in miniature. Chloe's voice, full of youthful wonder, painted a vivid picture of patience and growth, of finding immense beauty in the smallest of things. Again, the flicker. This time, Emily's eyelids, though still closed, seemed to flutter for a fraction of a second. Aunt Beatrice's heart, which had been a leaden weight in her chest for weeks, lightened, a fragile hope unfurling its delicate petals. She continued playing the recordings, a medley of youthful voices, of innocent narratives, of stories Emily herself had nurtured and praised. There was a story about a stray cat finding a home, one about a whispered secret between siblings, another about the taste of a grandmother's secret recipe. Each one, a small, perfectly formed universe, a testament to the power of shared experience. And then a new idea sparked. Emily had always been a weaver of narratives, not just a consumer. Her love for literature wasn't passive, it was an active, generative force. What if, instead of just listening, Emily could participate? But how in her current state? Aunt Beatrice began, tentatively at first, to narrate the unwritten chapters of the people they encountered in the hospital. She began with the stoic nurse, Nurse Anya, whose quiet efficiency and weary kindness spoke of a life dedicated to healing. You know, Emily, Aunt Beatrice began, her voice soft, almost a murmur. Nurse Anya reminds me of a character in one of your favorite Russian novels. So much quiet strength. I wonder what her story is. Does she have a secret garden at home, filled with exotic plants that she nurtures with the same care she gives her patients? Or perhaps she dreams of traveling the world, seeking out forgotten libraries filled with ancient texts? Aunt Beatrice paused, watching for any sign. Emily's breathing remained shallow, but the tension around her eyes seemed to lessen, almost imperceptibly. Encouraged, Aunt Beatrice continued. She described the worried father they saw every day in the hallway, his face etched with anxiety, always clutching a tattered teddy bear. He looks like a man who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders, doesn't he? Aunt Beatrice mused. I bet he was once a fearless adventurer, scaling mountains, charting unknown territories. And now his greatest adventure is navigating these hospital corridors. His only map, the love for his child. What do you think, Emily? Is he secretly writing a heroic saga in his head about a tiny warrior battling unseen dragons? She didn't expect a verbal response. She just kept weaving, the cheerful, elderly cleaning lady who hummed show tunes as she mopped the floors. Was she a frustrated opera singer, her voice too big for small stages? The young intern perpetually rushing, a coffee stain on his white coat. Was he driven by a past failure, desperate to atone, or by a burning desire to unlock the secrets of the universe? Slowly, painstakingly, Emily began to respond. It wasn't with words, not yet. It was with touch. Aunt Beatrice would narrate a chapter, her voice a steady balm in the sterile room, and then pause, her hand resting gently on Emily's. If Emily approved, if the narrative resonated, her index finger, frail and translucent, would trace a tiny, almost imperceptible circle on Aunt Beatrice's palm. A subtle, silent affirmation. If the story fell flat, if it didn't capture her imagination, her finger would remain still or twitch away in a tiny, almost imperceptible rejection. It became their shared ritual. Aunt Beatrice would come in, armed with observations from the hospital, from the brief snippets of conversation she overheard, from the gestures she witnessed. She would paint vivid portraits, crafting backstories and future aspirations for the nameless faces that populated their hospital world. And Emily, with her silent, delicate touch, would guide her, a conductor of unspoken narratives. Today, Aunt Beatrice might say, her voice low and conspiratorial, I saw the woman from room 302, the one with the vibrant purple scarf. She was looking out the window, a faraway look in her eyes. I think she was once a dancer, a prima ballerina perhaps, twirling across grand stages, her movements telling stories without words. What do you think, Emily? Emily's finger would trace a firm, confident circle. Yes, this one resonated. Sometimes after a particularly compelling chapter, Emily would gently squeeze Aunt Beatrice's hand, a silent demand for more. Her grip, though weak, held a nascent urgency, a rekindled spark of engagement. The blank page of her mind, which had felt so desolate, was now being filled, not by her own words, but by the shared collaborative act of creating narratives for others. It was a giving, a pouring out of herself, even in her incapacitated state. And in this act of giving, of weaving threads of possibility for strangers, something within Emily, a long dormant mechanism, began to stir. The eyes, though still clouded, held glimmers of focus. The faint lines of apathy around her mouth softened. There was a nascent engagement, a sense of purpose, however fragile, returning. The silent stories woven between two hands were beginning to mend something deeper than just a fractured mind. They were mending a spirit. Then came the seizures. The first one was mild, a subtle tremor in her left hand, a momentary stiffening. Aunt Beatrice, ever vigilant, noticed it immediately, her heart seizing in her chest. But the second one, just hours later, was violent, a full-body convulsion that threw Emily against the padded rails of her hospital bed. Her eyes rolled back, a guttural cry escaping her lips, and then she was still, her breathing shallow, ragged. Doctors and nurses swarmed, a blur of worried faces and urgent commands. The neurological crisis had arrived, just as they had warned it might. Emily lay in a comatose state, hooked up to a bewildering array of machines that beeped and hummed, each sound a stark reminder of the tenuous thread by which her life now hung. The medical team was grim. Her brain activity is minimal, Dr. Aris, the lead neurologist, had explained, his voice gentle but devoid of hope. We've done all we can. It's a matter of waiting now. Aunt Beatrice refused to wait silently. The sterile quiet of the ICU room was an assault, a vacuum that threatened to swallow Emily whole. She pulled a chair close to Emily's bedside, her hand clasping Emily's unnaturally cold one. Her voice, hoarse from days of unspoken fear, began to weave. She didn't consciously decide to narrate. It simply flowed, an unstoppable torrent of words, a desperate final act of love. "Emily," she began, her voice a whisper at first, then gaining strength. "Do you remember that first story you ever wrote? You were 6, and it was about a brave little squirrel who gathered acorns for the whole forest, even though he was afraid of heights. You illustrated it with crayon drawings, and the squirrel had a tiny, determined frown, just like yours when you're working on something important." She moved from memory to memory, painting Emily's life in vivid strokes. "And then there was the time you convinced Mrs. Henderson to let the entire 3rd grade class perform Hamlet as a puppet show because you said Shakespeare shouldn't just be read, it should be lived. You were Ophelia, and even then, your aphasia was only a minor inconvenience, not a wall. You improvised the lines you couldn't remember, making them even more poignant." Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop. She recounted Emily's passion for teaching, the way her eyes would light up when a student finally grasped a complex literary concept. She spoke of the young girl who wrote the story about the resilient grandparent, the one that had sparked that first flicker of recognition in Emily. She saw you, Emily. She saw your quiet strength, your unwavering belief in the power of a story. And you saw her, too. Aunt Beatrice then began to narrate Emily's dreams, the ones they had spoken about on long walks in the park, the ones Emily had confided in her late at night. "You want to publish your collection, Emily, not just for yourself, but because you believe everyone has a story that deserves to be heard, to be honored. You want to create a world where every voice, no matter how small or unheard, finds its audience. And you will, Emily. You will write them. You'll write about the kindness of strangers, the resilience of the human spirit, the hidden narratives that shape our lives. You'll write about the quiet courage you've shown through all of this, even when you didn't know you had it." She described Emily's future, a future where she would stand before a class, her voice strong and clear, her mind a wellspring of ideas. A future where she would sit at her old wooden desk, the scent of aged paper and fresh ink filling the air, weaving words into tapestries. "You will laugh freely again, Emily. Laugh until your sides hurt and the words will flow, an endless river. You will walk in the sunshine, feeling the warmth on your skin, and every leaf, every blade of grass will whisper a new story to you. You will teach them all, Emily, the ones who think they have no voice, the ones who have forgotten how to dream. You will show them how to find their own narratives, how to make them sing." Aunt Beatrice's voice was a raw, desperate prayer, a narrative laid bare, not for Emily to hear with her ears, but for her very essence to absorb. She recounted not just Emily's past, but her future, weaving it into a tapestry of undeniable, vibrant life. She was creating a narrative so compelling, so imbued with love and conviction, that it felt as though it could physically conjure the Emily she knew and loved back into being. Every word was a desperate plea, an act of faith against the overwhelming tide of medical reality. She would not let Emily's story end here, on this cold, sterile page of a hospital chart. She would write the next chapter herself if she had to, with every fiber of her being. Hours passed. The nurses checked Emily's vitals, their faces still etched with professional concern, but they left Aunt Beatrice to her vigil, her solitary, impassioned performance. The only sounds in the room were the rhythmic beeps of the machines and Aunt Beatrice's unwavering, almost hypnotic narration, a lullaby of life against the encroaching silence. Her own body ached with weariness, but her spirit was aflame. She was Emily's narrator, her scribe, her living, breathing book of life, and she would not close the cover. Not yet. Aunt Beatrice refused to wait silently. The sterile hum of the machines was a counterpoint to the panicked thrumming of her own heart. Dr. Aris's words, minimal brain activity, echoed in her mind, but she pushed them away, replacing them with a desperate, unwavering resolve. If Emily's story was ending, then Beatrice would write the most glorious, defiant final chapter she possibly could. She pulled a chair close to Emily's bedside, her hand finding Emily's limp one, intertwining their fingers, and she began to speak. Her voice, hoarse from days of suppressed terror, began to weave a tapestry of Emily's life. "You, my dear Emily," she whispered, her gaze fixed on Emily's still face. "You were born with stardust in your veins and stories in your soul. Remember that tiny notebook you carried everywhere as a child? The one filled with observations about squirrels and the secret lives of puddles? Even then, you saw the narratives others missed." She spoke of Emily's first day of teaching, of the shy, eager faces in her classroom, of the way Emily made literature sing, transforming dusty texts into vibrant worlds. She recounted the proud day Emily received her degree, the dreams of a future filled with books and students swirling around her like a protective aura. "You taught them to find their voices, Em. You taught them that every life is a story, worth telling, worth cherishing." Her voice grew louder, more insistent, as if she could physically inject these memories, these truths, into Emily's failing brain. She described the scent of old books, the murmur of student voices in the library, the crisp autumn air on the walk to school, the warmth of a mug of tea after a long day of lesson planning. She painted vivid pictures of Emily's quirks, her habit of humming classical music off-key when she was deep in thought, the way she'd chew on the end of her pen, leaving teeth marks when grappling with a complex idea. "And your stories, Em," Aunt Beatrice continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The ones you wanted to write. The collection, remember? Ephemeral echoes, you called it. Stories about the quiet heroes, the unseen threads that connect us all. You always believed in the power of connection, of shared vulnerability. You taught me that too." Then with a sudden surge of fierce, almost defiant hope, Aunt Beatrice began to narrate Emily's future. Not a future of illness, but a future ablaze with life. "You will walk out of this hospital, Emily. You will feel the sun on your face, taste real food again. You will sit at your desk, the one by the window, and the words will flow from your fingertips like a river. You will write that collection, and it will touch hearts you can't even imagine. Your students will return to you, bringing their new stories, and you will guide them, as you always have." She described Emily, years from now, a wise and celebrated author, still teaching, still inspiring. She imagined Emily laughing, truly laughing, the deep, unrestrained laugh that had been absent for so long. She described Emily feeling the familiar comfort of a book in her hands, the thrill of a newly turned page. Aunt Beatrice poured every ounce of her love, her belief, her desperate hope into this spoken narrative, willing it into existence. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, oblivious to the fierce, almost magical act of creation unfolding beside them. Days blurred into a terrifying vigil. The medical team continued their checks, their expressions unchangingly grim, though they did not interrupt Aunt Beatrice's incessant monologue. They knew, as she knew, that traditional medicine had reached its limits. Then late on the third day after the seizure, something shifted. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in Emily's left eyelid. Aunt Beatrice, her eyes red-rimmed but watchful, saw it. She squeezed Emily's hand, a silent question. A few minutes later, the tremor repeated, a little stronger this time. The next morning, Dr. Aris walked in, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He checked the monitors, then Emily's pupils. He took a long, slow breath. "Her brain activity," he began, his voice laced with an unfamiliar note of bewilderment. "It's increasing, rapidly, and the neurological markers, they're showing signs of reorganization, significant reorganization." Aunt Beatrice could only nod, tears streaming down her face. She knew. She had felt the tide turning, the narrative taking hold. Over the next 48 hours, Emily's recovery defied all medical precedent. The aphasia, which had been a tangled web of garbled sounds and frustrating silence, began to unravel. First single words, then hesitant phrases. "Water, please." Her first coherent request in months. The cognitive disinhibition, the impulsive, often inappropriate outbursts, faded into a quiet, almost shy demeanor. Her eyes, which had been vacant for so long, slowly regained their light, their focused intensity. When Emily finally opened her eyes and looked at Aunt Beatrice, truly looked at her, a profound sense of clarity shone within them. She was still physically weak, her body a fragile vessel, but her mind felt as though it had been untangled, reordered. Later, when she had enough strength to speak for more than a few minutes, Emily described it to a baffled Dr. Aris. "It was like a manuscript," she whispered, her voice raspy. "A huge, beautiful manuscript. But it had been thrown to the floor, pages scattered, chapters ripped apart. And then, during the crisis, it was as if someone had painstakingly gathered every single page, every single word, and put it back in perfect order." An unprecedented neural reorganization, you said? I think it was just my story, finally finding its way home. The medical team, unable to explain the phenomenon, could only refer to it as an unprecedented neural reorganization, a medical marvel that bordered on the miraculous. Emily, though still frail, was undeniably back, and she began to speak. Her voice, hoarse from days of suppressed terror, began to weave a tapestry of Emily's life. "You, my dear Emily," she whispered, her gaze fixed on Emily's still face. "You were born with stardust in your veins and stories in your soul. Remember that tiny notebook you carried everywhere as a child? The one filled with observations about squirrels and the secret lives of puddles? Even then, you saw the narratives others missed." She spoke of Emily's first day of teaching, the nervous excitement, the way she captivated her students with a single, perfectly chosen metaphor. She recounted the joy Emily found in their messy, imperfect creative writing, how she saw nascent authors in every hesitant paragraph. She wove in anecdotes from Emily's childhood, the plays they'd put on in the living room, the way Emily would meticulously craft backstories for every doll, every pebble. "You didn't just read stories, Emily," Aunt Beatrice murmured, tears tracing paths through the worry lines on her face. "You lived them. You made them. You taught others to find their own voices, to build their own worlds with words." Then, with a sudden, fierce conviction, Aunt Beatrice shifted her narrative. She began to speak of Emily's future, not as a desperate plea, but as an undeniable truth. "You will return to that classroom, Emily. You will. And you will tell them about this, not as a tragedy, but as another unwritten chapter that you, in your quiet strength, forced into being. You will write your own collection, not about the darkness, but about the light you found in the shared act of creation. You will inspire them, just as you always have." She described Emily, vibrant and whole, at a book signing, her stories touching countless lives. She painted a vivid picture of Emily, years from now, a wise and celebrated author, her voice clear, her mind a wellspring of narratives. "You will stand on stage, Emily," she insisted, her voice rising above the rhythmic beeps of the machines. "And the applause will be for life itself, for the story you chose to tell." The medical team, accustomed to the quiet despair of critical care units, watched Aunt Beatrice with a mix of awe and pity. They saw a woman clinging to a last, fragile hope, pouring her soul into a void. Dr. Aris, having exhausted all medical interventions, had allowed her continued presence, recognizing the therapeutic value, however slim, of her unwavering devotion. He noted the subtle shifts in Emily's vital signs, still critical, but no longer plummeting. A plateau, perhaps, before the inevitable decline. But the decline never came. The next morning, a subtle, almost imperceptible change registered on the monitors. Emily's brain activity, which had been flatlining, showed a faint, wavering pattern. It intensified throughout the day, a tiny spark igniting into a flickering flame. Aunt Beatrice, who had fallen asleep in the chair, her hands still clasped around Emily's, woke with a start when a nurse gasped. Emily's eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, they lifted. Her eyes, unfocused at first, drifted around the room, then landed on Aunt Beatrice's tear-streaked face. A faint, almost imperceptible pressure registered in Beatrice's hand. Over the next few days, the medical team watched in the stunned disbelief. Emily's cognitive function, previously almost non-existent, began to rebound with astonishing speed. The aphasia, which had rendered her mute, receded like a forgotten tide. First single words, then hesitant phrases, then coherent sentences, spoken with a slight tremor, but unmistakable clarity. The cognitive disinhibition, the impulsive, erratic behavior, vanished almost entirely. Neurological scans repeated with increasing frequency showed what Dr. Aries, shaking his head in wonder, could only describe as an unprecedented neural reorganization. The tangled pathways, once choked and dysfunctional, now appeared to be reconnecting, forming new, efficient networks with startling rapidity. When Emily was lucid enough to speak at length, she described the experience as if a tangled manuscript in her mind, a chaotic mess of words and ideas, had been suddenly, violently unspooled during the seizure, and then, in the quiet aftermath, meticulously reordered. It was like the story of me was falling apart, she whispered, her voice still weak but imbued with a new kind of resonance. And then, in the darkness, I felt someone putting it back together, thread by thread, word by word, making sense of the chaos. Not just my story, but all the stories. They all connected suddenly. The doctors, still baffled, could only theorize about the mechanism. Was it the intense stress of the seizure that somehow triggered a rare compensatory neurological event? Was it the brain, pushed to the brink of collapse, that rewrote its own operating system? Or was there, as some whispered, a deeper, less explicable force at play? Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. Emily, though physically weakened by months of illness, was mentally clearer, sharper, and more acutely aware than she had been since before the diagnosis. The shadow of a typical lymphoma still lingered in her blood, but the neurological devastation that had crippled her had, against all odds, been largely reversed. The blank page of her mind was not only filled, but illuminated. Emily underwent a final, less intensive round of chemotherapy, the powerful drugs now working on a body that was inexplicably, gloriously fighting back. Weeks turned into months. She was declared in remission. The day she walked out of the hospital, the sun felt impossibly bright, the air impossibly sweet. Aunt Beatrice was there, of course, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief, her hand squeezing Emily's. Her return to teaching was gradual, but profound. Emily was no longer just a literature teacher. She was a living testament to the power of narrative, of connection, of shared vulnerability. She started a unique class, the Unwritten Chronicles, where students weren't just reading stories, but actively creating them. They collaborated on a community narrative project, interviewing residents in their neighborhood. The quiet librarian, the gruff but kind butcher, the elderly woman who tended a vibrant rooftop garden, collecting and sharing their unwritten stories. Emily taught them to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to listen deeply, to empathize, and to understand that every single life was a rich, complex narrative waiting to be told. Emily herself began writing her own collection. It wasn't about her illness, not directly, but about the profound interconnectedness she had discovered through shared narratives, about the resilience of the human spirit, about the quiet miracles found in everyday acts of empathy. She dedicated it to Aunt Beatrice, her first and most steadfast collaborator, the one who had literally narrated her back to life. The final scene of that year found her in her classroom, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her voice, clear and resonant, filled the room as she read from a student's project. A beautifully crafted story about a street sweeper who secretly wrote poetry. Her students were captivated, their faces alight with understanding. As she finished, a quiet, almost reverent silence filled the room, followed by the rustle of notebooks and the soft murmur of appreciation. It wasn't an ovation, not yet, but a quiet applause for life's unfolding story. A story that Emily, once lost and silent, was now helping to write, one precious word at a time.